This is the opening for the plaintiff, take 789. Driving recklessly is not an accident, it's a choice. Good morning, members of the jury. Thank you very much for your service here today. You're here today because a man has lost his life. That man's name was Andy Little. Andy Little was a loving husband, a minister in his community, and he was about to become a dad. On October 31st, 2004, Andy was killed when his vehicle collided with a bucket truck driven by Dana Mylanta, an employee of the defendant, Big A Utility Company. My name is John Scott Buell. Together with my co-counsel, we represent Lisa Richardson, the administrator of Andy's estate. Lisa was Andy's wife. Andy was the man that she relied upon to support their family. Lisa's also the mother of Andy Little Jr., Andy's son. October 31st, 2004 was just a regular Halloween night for Lisa and Andy. They didn't have any big plans. They were just hanging out, watching some Halloween movies, and enjoying each other's company. At approximately 9 p.m. that night, Andy decided to step out for a minute to get a pack of cigarettes from the local Buffalo Chip. He waved goodbye to Lisa and headed out the door. Unfortunately, that was the last time that Lisa was ever going to see Andy alive again. The evidence that we present to you today will show that Andy was the victim of a car accident that occurred at approximately 11:45 that night. That his vehicle was found smashed, crushed, underneath a bucket truck operated by Dana Mylanta. Now, what's a bucket truck, you might be asking yourself? Well, it's like a cement truck. It is a massive vehicle. Its trailer holds a crane mechanism that hoists people into the air. So think of something like a tree trimmer or a fire engine. The evidence is going to show that Andy Little was driving south on the access road to the highway. As Dana Mylanta was driving this bucket truck, this massive vehicle, in reverse, she was going backwards at a high rate of speed. She collided with Andy's vehicle and took his life. Now I want to make one thing very clear to you, and that's that nobody throughout the course of this trial is going to say that Dana Mylanta intended to strike Andy's vehicle. She didn't hit him on purpose, but what we will show throughout the course of this trial is that Dana Mylanta was operating her bucket truck, her massive vehicle, negligently. And it's because of her negligence that Andy is no longer with us today. It's because of her negligence that Andy Little Jr. is going to grow up and never know the sound of his father's voice. Now, the evidence that we present to you today will show that Dana Mylanta and her crew of Big A workers were on a job that night. They were looking for a busted fuse box. Initially, the evidence will show that they drove past the fuse box they were looking for, and Dana Mylanta made a choice. Rather than follow the flow of traffic and go all the way back around to circle back to where they needed to be, Dana Mylanta decided instead to throw the bucket truck in reverse for a quarter of a mile to get back to this fuse box. The evidence that we present to you today will show that the team from Big A eventually found the fuse box they were looking for right outside the Laidlaw Cemetery. And Dana Mylanta was freaked out about being in that cemetery off Access Road 13, off Black Cat Lane on Halloween night. And she decided to make another choice. When they were finished with their job, she again chose to throw that bucket truck in reverse so they could get out of that cemetery as fast as possible. Only this time, when she did so, Andy Little happened to be driving by at that exact moment. She crushed Andy underneath her bucket truck. You can see the damage for yourself right here. And just like that, Lisa Richardson was made a widow. Now, the evidence that we present to you today will show that the law enforcement officer who responded to the scene gave Mylanta a citation for failing to yield to Andy's vehicle. And he'll also tell you that when he arrived at the scene, Dana Mylanta was laughing. She was cracking jokes just moments after Andy's life was snuffed out. Now, the defense is going to make a presentation to you as well, and they're going to try and convince you that this tragedy was Andy's own fault. They're going to try and blame Andy for what happened to him. And they hired their own expert, Joe Mitchell, who's going to try and convince you that Andy was drunk, that he was driving too fast, that he didn't brake, and that he should have seen that bucket truck coming at him. Now, as jury members, it is your job to ask yourselves, what are the bases for his conclusions? Well, you're going to hear about Joe Mitchell's investigation, or lack thereof. You're going to hear that Joe Mitchell did not perform a single scientific test before he reached his conclusions. He didn't have skid marks to determine definitively how fast Andy was going. He didn't check Andy's car to see if it had ABS brakes, or to see if his lights were on. Now, he could have done both of those things, mind you, but according to Joe Mitchell, it's as cold as a polar bear's nose in Armadillo Lone Star in November. He got what he needed, and he found a better place to be. Ladies and gentlemen, Joe Mitchell did not do his due diligence in this investigation. Now, I want you to know something about Andy so that you don't think I'm trying to hide anything from you. Andy was a spiritual guy. He often liked to go out on his own and meditate. That was normal behavior for him. He also liked to smoke marijuana on occasion. But I want something to be clear. There is no evidence that marijuana or any drug was the cause of the accident that occurred on Halloween night in 2004. Dana Mylanta is a spiritual person herself. You'll hear testimony today that she's known as Mystic Dana because she has a fascination with talking to the dead, and that she was really freaked out about being in that cemetery on Halloween night off Black Cat Lane, off Highway 13. The evidence is going to show that Andy Little was killed because Miss Mylanta made a choice. For whatever reason, she chose to disobey her duty to drive her bucket truck responsibly, and it's because of that choice that Andy Little lost his life. Now, as the plaintiff, the party bringing Big A into court, Now, as the plaintiff, the party bringing Big A into court, it's our burden to prove to you that Dana Mylanta was negligent. In order to prove negligence, we have to prove to you three elements. Number one, that Dana Mylanta owed a duty of care to Andy to drive her bucket truck in a safe manner. Number two, that she breached that duty to Andy when she decided to throw her car in reverse and come flying out of that cemetery. And number three, it's because of that breach that Andy Little lost his life. Now, we as the plaintiff have the burden of proof, but the defense has a burden as well, and that's because they've asserted what's called an affirmative defense. They're going to try and persuade you that it was Andy's own negligence that caused this accident. And they have to prove their case by the same standard that we have to prove ours. But this isn't a murder trial. This isn't the reasonable doubt standard that you see on TV. This is a lesser standard. It's called comparative negligence. At the end of this trial, you're going to be presented with a simple question on a piece of paper, this piece of paper. And this piece of paper is going to ask you, what percentage of the fault is due to Dana Mylanta, the employee of Big A Utility Company? And what percentage of the blame goes to Andy? And when you use your logic, your reasoning, and your common sense to digest everything you've heard throughout the course of this trial, the answer is going to be clear. Dana Mylanta is responsible for the death of Andy Little. Driving recklessly was her choice. Make sure that choice has consequences. Thank you.